Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Rafael Knuth, your host. I'm a contributing editor at Data Science Central. I'd like to start our event off today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we are honored to have them sponsoring our event today. Today's webinar is entitled The Human Side of Organizational Change, Lessons from Tableau's Engineering Team, to be presented by Tableau. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be 1 hour long. We have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a minute. There will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A following today's presentation. And the event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, James Baker, with Tableau. James Baker's journey at Tableau has ranged from coding and architecture to people and processes to organization and systemic change. Understanding the way humans operate, best work together, and potentially solve massive coordination problems is what gets him up in the morning. He's always striving to be the best version of himself, having discovered that human development is essential to success in software development and organizational development. Thanks for being with us today, James. We're looking forward to your presentation. Are you struggling to bring about change in your organization? Is your team or company stuck in entrenched models of behavior despite your awesome data visualizations? What now? Even as a data company, Tableau itself has wrestled with the very human difficulty of doing what we want to do. In today's Data Science Central webinar, a member of Tableau's engineering team will discuss change management and behavioral engineering techniques that can equip you to power humane human change within your organization. James, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
All right. Excuse me. Thank you, Rafael, and thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'm just so glad to be here. I have worked in various engineering roles on the product development team here at Tableau for the last dozen years now, originally as a software developer. And over these dozen years, the company has grown from 40 people when I joined to over 4,000 today. So those experiences have made me, I'll say, a student of change, unintentionally at first, but then very intentionally over the last 5 years or so. I'll still say right up front that I don't have all of the answers by any means. I remain a student of change, but I'm happy to be here and I'm happy to share the best lessons that I've learned so far in the spirit of all of us continuing our learning journey together. I have ordered our path, our agenda today, to start with the conventional and head towards the cutting edge. This has been a kind of surprising and amazing journey for me, and this is the order in which I learned those things. So this also means that we'll start practically with some fairly concrete change techniques up front, and then if you stick around long enough, we'll reach my more radical philosophizing. And I think that's the really fun stuff, but you can judge for yourself. All right. So let's just dive in to change management. I remember when I first discovered that this was a thing, that change management was a whole field that had existed for a few decades before I'd even heard of it. And I thought, oh yeah, sign me up. Yeah, someone else has solved this, so I'll grab my handy-dandy instruction booklet and off I go. Yeah, so time has dispelled most of my illusions of that sort. There are no magical incantations, and simplistic recipes can sometimes produce unappetizing meals in different contexts. And every context has at least a little something different. At this point now, At this point, I look at change management and I even question some of the implications baked into the term itself. I'll cover that a little more, but the field of change management arose in the first place because humans and organizations are complex, adaptive systems that kind of resist simple recipes and rules, and so it's a little bit like trying to solve our problems with the same kind of thinking that created those problems in the first place. But there are still a lot of very good things in here. So to start off, let's talk about goals. And this is very basic, but just to say right off, yes, you need some goals. The more specific and intentional, the better they are. If you call your goal a BHAG, I've heard this called a big, hairy, audacious goal, then you've got something, and you might share an understanding of what it is that you're all going after together. Or if you define some key performance indicators, then you've at least decided to measure something good and add data to your definition. I think the gold standard these days, in perception at least, is called OKRs. This OKRs stands for Objectives and Key Results. This encourages you to define both what you want, the objective, and how you're going to measure the key results in a way such that those add up to the objective. Here is a recent book by the guy who brought OKRs to Google, kind of from Intel originally in the early days. The book is a little fluffy, but this is a good intro. I do recommend it. It's we are currently standardizing our goal setting at Tableau, regularizing it using OKR terminology. And I want to share one lesson just from within the last year here for us. In terms of, so I like to think of this in terms of outputs versus outcomes. In my mind, the outcomes are what you really care about. The outputs are what you are actually going to get and what you actually can measure, maybe. And that is also distinct from the things that you actually do, the inputs, the activities and effort that you put into it. So don't let any part of your OKRs, your goal setting, be about the inputs, about the effort that you expand. What you care about is ultimately the result you get, that objective or that outcome. And whether the things that you can measure, your key results, add up to your actual goal. Now, setting a goal is the easy part compared to how you can actually achieve that goal. This leads us into change management proper, where the most famous name, I think, in my impression, is Kotter, and Kotter's 8-step process for leading change. This was published in 1996 and was utterly groundbreaking 20-something years ago, as it popularized and legitimized the fact that there is a whole art and science to change. It's good stuff, and I tore through this book about 4 years ago, and it opened my eyes to some things. Looking back at this list of these steps a few years later, I still see it as good, but I do want to give some additional caution and context. I think this writing and the mindset behind it makes some assumptions. Assumptions such as that change is an exceptional thing that you do once in a while before going back to normal, or that change management equals multi-year time spans and armies of people, or that change comes from the top and flows downward, or even that people resist change inherently, and you just have to work and struggle to overcome that resistance. Well, some modern research has been showing that people don't actually resist change so much as people just don't like having seemingly random things done to them by distant decision makers in a way that disrespects their autonomy and doesn't meet their own needs. So, well, let's not do that. But you can still look at this list and ask yourself things like, Do other people share the sense of urgency that I feel about this change? Who can I enlist as fellow change makers? How can we get some quick wins that demonstrate the value of this change and build momentum? If you miss some of the things on this list, there is a high probability that you will fail to effect that change. This isn't necessarily a foolproof recipe for success, but it's a good gut check of necessary ingredients. The next model I want to share, very similarly, is called AddCar, just the acronym there. This one pivots a bit from solution steps towards the needs that you want to address in change management. And where Kotter's approach felt to me to be targeted at sweeping, very big changes, my vibe from AddCar is that it kind of hits a sweet spot with small to medium-sized changes. It's very practical. It's fairly simple. I like to check this list for things like tool adoption, small policy changes, or anything that doesn't need deeper cultural or social support for adoption. As an example, we had a tool for our software developers here at Tableau that would check the code complexity impact of their code changes before they submitted them. So we asked ourselves, okay, how are they going to know this tool exists? Why are they going to want to use it? How are they going to know how to use it? Will anything prevent them from using it like they want? And how are we going to reinforce this change and make using this tool sticky so that they keep using it over time? Those questions influenced our rollout of the tool and our communications, but even more than that, they influenced how we designed the tool to be easier to use in the first place as we thought about its adoption and the change management. Okay. So far, Kotter's 8 steps and AddCar, they line up and correspond pretty well. Desire here was urgency for Kotter. Awareness was vision. Reinforcement was institutionalization. Now, I referenced not using this model for deeper cultural or social change, and so that leads me to my third and last change management model that I want to talk about today. We've called this one the behavior engineering model inside Tableau, although it's actually an unpublished innovation on something originally named this, the innovation by my now former colleague, Arlo Belshi. The roots go all the way back to kind of psychologist B.F. Skinner, and this name, behavior engineering model, showed up in a 1978 book by Thomas Gilbert about high performance. It was refined in 1998 in what was called the 6 boxes model, which in turn led to our internal 2018 version. This is an ordered list of the things that influence people's behaviors: norms and expectations, tools and processes, data and visible results, skills and knowledge. And we generally stop there after 4. Number 5, raw capability, is hopefully more or less taken care of by your organization's hiring process. And as for number 6, people generally already want to do a good job in their work. And recent research has amply shown that trying to add extrinsic motivators can actually displace and destroy a lot of people's intrinsic motivation. So we take these top 4, we multiplex them by whether they are on the interior or exterior of a person, whether they are intrapersonal or interpersonal, and create this 4x2 grid is the actual model. Now, I believe personally that the reason that someone does or doesn't exhibit some behavior in a given context falls into one of these categories, some absurdly high percentage of the time. This is a power tool of a model. I'll go through these here and list what these 8 sections are. The most important column by far is norms and expectations, the beliefs that we hold inside of our own head as well as the social norms in groups or teams of people. These are the expectations that we don't think to question because that's just the way that we do things around here, consciously or unconsciously. Even inside of ourselves, we believe what we believe, of course, the things that we believe, and we believe a lot of those things not because they are true upon deep reflection necessarily, but because they help protect us in some way. They've been adaptive for us. In the second column, we look at tools and how our tools shape and support the work that we do and the behaviors that we take. And then governance, in this sense, governance processes are akin to social tooling about how we make decisions and how we regulate ourselves and our behaviors. Now, data is super important, and I know this crowd, more than any other crowd, would agree with me on that. As strongly as I do, it's also just a piece of the puzzle when it comes to humans and their behavior. On a personal level, data needs to come to you as the immediate effect or outcome of a behavior. It at least needs to show up fast enough for you to associate it with that behavior so that you can use that feedback in your action loop as you decide to take your next step, what you're going to do next. And then assessment on the exterior refers to the data that other folks are going to look at, kind of the typical kind of reinforcement from management checking that your numbers look good. Lastly, in terms of skills and knowledge, which in any kind of knowledge work are almost synonymous terms for me, here we look at whether we can learn what we need ourselves by knowing what we need and pulling in the knowledge and knowing how to do that, or whether we don't know what we need and it needs to be pushed to people. And, well, hopefully then they want it when they do learn what it is that they actually need to know. So, 8 buckets, there's a lot there, and I use this map in a couple different ways. First, I'll make a descriptive map of what is supporting the current behaviors. And then I'll separately make a prescriptive map of what changes or what would be different that would support the desired behaviors. And honestly, sometimes I just sit and stare at that norms and expectations column, the first one on the left, and just think about what's really going on beneath the surface level, because there's so much there. So I know that was all quick, but that wraps up my change management models, which all of those do assume that you already know what needs to change. But how do we get to that point in the first place? Let's talk next about discovering what it is that needs to change. What's the right thing to change, especially within a group or an organizational context? Even if you think that you know exactly what a solution should be, and I have been in this situation, I have observed that going through a discovery process with other people is a lot more effective than me just telling them my expert opinion and expecting everybody else to fall in line. This is more effective not just in the sense of them believing in my proposal, but in coming up with better proposals and better approaches. And of course, having partners in co-creating a change gives you a coalition of allies, ready-made, built in, that share the ownership of and the drive for that change. Now, if I may, and this is for mostly my own curiosity, I would love to poll the audience. I'd love to ask you about your current experience in whatever organization you're currently in. Please just go ahead and click and select the most appropriate option. One, that your org is not agile or doesn't need it, or maybe you work alone, so it's not relevant. The second, that your org is at least identifying as doing agile methodologies, trying to in some way. Or thirdly, adding on to that, your org is doing agile and you are on a small team that as part of its regular working practices, participates in regular retrospectives. If you're doing retrospectives, you probably know what they are already. If not, retrospecting means looking back over past events, over the past sprint if you're doing Scrum, with a focus on improving how things are working. It's a meta work practice, an intentional discussion about how the work is going and how it could go better, whether that's improving on strengths or identifying and addressing impediments. All right, last chance to vote here. Go ahead and get those last clicks in. All right, and I'm going to move on in 3, 2, 1. Thanks for all those votes. All right, I'll show that in a sec. This is a great book on doing retrospectives. One of our Agile coaches here at Tableau calls it his Bible. And there are other somewhat similar practices near retrospectives, like postmortems and root cause analysis, and we love RCAs at Tableau. Yet, I really want to emphasize retrospectives as the most proactive about learning and improving, regardless of whether anything went visibly wrong or not. Retros can and should touch on anything, including team dynamics, and not just the direct object work itself. All right, let's look at these poll results here. All right, 30% of folks in organizations or solo that are not Agile, so a minority of folks. Wow, over 50%, and adding those two numbers up, that's 60, that's 70%, the inverse of 30, of course, of doing Agile. Wow, I'm continually amazed by these days by how far it's spread. But it looks like a minority of folks identifying as doing Agile are doing retrospectives, and I find that so interesting. I don't want to shame anybody, by no means, but just to me, retrospectives are so core to Agile methodologies and the concept of agility. And I want to point out that you don't even need to be doing Agile at all in order to do this practice. To adopt this. There's no better place to start as long as you commit to doing the improvement work that comes out of retrospectives. If you don't remove the impediments that are identified, then it just becomes a gripe session with no point to it. Functioning retrospectives, though, can handle a ton of change and improvement at the team level. Teams and teamwork can just be so amazing when they're really working well. And identifying what's not clicking in the first place is sometimes even harder than actually fixing things. So, thank you. Another awesome discovery tool is called structural tension. We use this one all the time at Tableau. We see it everywhere. Very simply, it's about the tension between the way things are and the way that you'd like them to be. The model is a way of being intentional about seeing and exploring that gap. Just get a group together with a whiteboard or with some sticky notes and just start writing. What is the ideal state of the world that we would like to see? And then next to that, describe what is the current state of reality. Compare and contrast those two things, and simple as it sounds, you'll be amazed at what pops out at you. This helps you see and name the changes that you need to address that tension and bridge that gap. There are more questions in this model and more variations on this model. It's probably been invented thousands of times independently, but I often find that these two questions are just all that I need. And remember that behavior engineering model? Yes, it starts with a change management goal, but the bulk of this even actually is a generative discovery process of what needs to change. And when I said I make a descriptive grid and a prescriptive grid, that's just another way of invoking the ideal state versus current reality concepts of structural tension. Here's one sample whiteboard of mine personally from here at our Seattle office, just to show two grids being used. In combining these two models, you don't have to fill out every space, but just seeing the spaces and encouraging yourself to examine the possibilities in these spaces, that is where the creative power comes from. Now, I would like to segue into some more structural approaches to breaking the constraints that make change hard in the first place. When you think about, traditional change management, overcoming people's resistance, the challenge here is kind of to see the water that we're swimming in. Like that joke, about fish swimming through the water but not knowing what the water is. The challenge is to see the stuff that we normally don't notice, that we don't even see. We just see our environment around us as a static backdrop without examining it and realizing that every piece of that environment around us can be an object that could be different. To come back to retrospectives for just one more moment, they're not just a change discovery mechanism. Beneath the actual impediments that are identified and addressed, what this does is it establishes a practice and a norm of continuous improvement. The inspect and adapt loop pulls us to see the structural tension and to ask ourselves regularly, what is the most awesome team and workplace we can imagine, and why aren't we that awesome? Thinking about awesome teams here, that takes me to a Google study called Project Aristotle a few years back now, where they did a big internal research study across their teams. And they crunched their data and came up with this list of the top 5 attributes of effective teams. Psychological safety tops the list, and then the ability to depend on each other, having structure and clarity for themselves, and work that has meaning and impact. But at the top, and I'll give a direct quote here, that they say, psychological safety was by far the most important dynamic of effective teams. Effective teams, so then, are places where people feel safe to take risks and be vulnerable with each other. If you can't take a risk without feeling insecure or embarrassed, then change becomes dangerous. I'll just say that again. Change becomes dangerous and improvement is actively avoided. So, how do we bring safety to a team? Google recommends frame the work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. Acknowledge your own fallibility. Model curiosity, and ask lots of questions. Let's come back to number 1 here. Learning, not execution. I think this is even more radical than it sounds on the face of it. Our deeply ingrained assumptions, in my opinion, are that results come from how well we execute, right? All about the execution. And so should learning really be more important than results just so we can feel safe, or something about feeling, psychological safety? But wait here, Google's research shows that safe teams are productive teams, are effective teams. There's really something here. So what does it mean, though, to optimize for learning? And how does that actually get us to results in the end? For this, I'm going to bring in the Lean Startup Model. This book, which is very readable, by the way, was published in 2011, and I think it's gotten a lot of traction already. Although I think some people perhaps heard about this and got the mistaken impression that this is only for startup companies. It is not. The heart of this model really is to weaponize the scientific method in the service of trying to learn and of trying to deliver amazing breakthrough results. So you can optimize for learning by using this build, measure, learn loop to disprove your assumptions and discover your wrongness as quickly as possible. It took me a few years personally to turn this from head knowledge into gut level knowledge and trust of the rightness of this. Now, though, I think that this is so widely applicable and so true that this has changed how I even look at business strategy and planning. Making big plans and placing big bets on big strategic moves is very risky. Lean Startup would say, instead, place lots of small bets abandon quickly the ones that were wrong and are not panning out, and double down on the ones that are hitting the jackpot or returning the reward. This gives lower risk and higher reward. So sounds great to me. But adopting this does require a heavy dose of humility about our ideas. We don't naturally enjoy being wrong or proving ourselves wrong. And so this requires a culture that doesn't flinch away from negative results, quote unquote negative, and the negativity there, but instead celebrates those as progress. Now, is this everything, or is there a place left for regular execution of standard work? Yes, totally. To answer the question of when to go lean and experimental versus when to just go heads down and execute, I like to look to this map provided by the Cynefin model by Dave Snowden. I like to call these myself spaces of knowability, where in different spaces, which space you're operating in can tell you how much you can know and how to manage your work in that domain. I'm going to use the example concretely of project management, of doing projects and making estimates. The typical project estimation uses a burn down chart that goes something like this, right? There's a high number on the left, there's a big fuzzy estimate at the start, and over time, as we progress towards the right, the work remaining just goes down, down, down steadily as the project progresses, all the way towards zero, and then you're done. And if this happens, this is called being in the obvious domain. But as you and I probably both know already, few things in the world are actually as obvious as they seem, or few projects progress exactly like this with no surprises. I very often see instead estimates heading upwards at the start of a project as more and more work is discovered. And then eventually a project will figure out what it doesn't know, gets the right expertise in, does the right analysis, and then the project eventually kind of turns a corner and starts burning down. This is what happens in what's called the complicated space, where things aren't necessarily simple, but expertise and analysis can still get the right answer, cause and effect is known. But if you don't know the right answer, and cause and effect are unclear even to the experts, then that's where you need to start experimenting because you are in the complex domain. This burn down chart for a learning type of project, learning projects, looks very different. Looks kind of like a point cloud there with very little visible progress. Because it goes like this, is this hypothesis right? Well, let's check. Nope. Not that one. Okay, how about this one? Nope. How about this one? Nope, nope, nope. Until you finally make that key discovery of whatever it is, and the line basically snaps to zero down at the bottom there because, hey, you've solved it. My coworker Jay says, success in a complex domain looks like a series of failures. Because there are many more negative results than positive results as you try to experiment and find your way. So I think that's accurate. And also, when we succeed in our learning, of course, we may still have work to execute on in the obvious or complicated space to make use of that learning. Real-world work and big changes or projects are always a mix, aren't they, of all of these spaces? But my claim is that a team that can optimize for adaptation and learning is a team that can knowingly spend time in the complex space intentionally. And the more time, the better, in my opinion, rather than trying to pretend that our challenges all live on the right side of this map. And so Lean Startup is a great way to enable that over in the complex space. And this is all very compatible with Agile methodologies, or at least the spirit of the Agile Manifesto. In order to optimize for learning and be agile and adaptable and changeable, I like to say, this is just me personally, that you need three pieces. First, agile teaming. Continuously improving teams, doing retrospectives that build trust and dependability and safety with each other internally. Then you need agile engineering, or whatever kind of work you're doing if it's not called engineering. continuous learning here through customer engagement, lean startup, incremental development, and experimentation. And finally, then, you do need a shift in leadership. When we started our Agile journey within the Tableau development team several years ago now, we didn't fully see this or grok this, and we kind of fell into the common mistake of just trying to train the teams to be Agile, quote unquote, without changing much about how our leadership operated. We held on to assumptions about decision-making and planning and execution mindset, and pretty quickly hit a soft wall where teams wanting to be more agile were bumping up against organizational impediments and things outside their control, trying to fit that into a traditional command and control hierarchy of execution mindset. Now, I think that this one failure explains the majority of bad Agile in the world. Because all three parts of this triangle need to work in alignment for things to really click. And since Agile is a whole industry itself these days, I think you can find that there are a lot of experts and old-timers that, in my opinion, are saying similar things. If you want a real model that is better and more formal than mine, I'll recommend the Agile Fluency model, developed by Agile luminaries James Shore and Diana Larson. My triangle sort of kind of maps onto this, but if you want to get serious about agility, just go look this one up. All right, so finally, I want to go one last level deeper. And here I want to talk actually about consciousness and psychological complexity and culture. This is the buckle your seatbelt zone if you're on board for this ride. I believe that our organizations and our workplaces could be radically improved environments where we bring our whole selves, assist each other in personal development and growth, and inhabit a mindful adaptability where old-style conventional change management kind of fades away. I also believe that this doesn't need to come at the expense of effectiveness or profits, that joy is compatible with and an enabler of success. If you want to catch a little more of the spirit of this, I can recommend reading Joy, Inc. by Richard Sheridan of Menlo Innovations. This is just an inspirational book for me. But to go into how this, though, I'm going to dig down deeper into the land of developmental psychology. About 40 years ago, researchers put together the more or less still current model of adult development, recognizing how adults keep on growing, not in physical brain structure, but in psychological complexity. There are particular stages and transitions that people tend to grow through. I mean, common vernacular might sort of call this growing in maturity, growing in perspective, growing in wisdom even. And, roughly, Robert Keegan and other psychologists call this kind of movement the subject-to-object shift. Remember when I mentioned seeing the water that we swim in? As our perspective expands, things which we were once subject to and inside of become visible to us as objects. They start to become object. We become more psychologically spacious, and we become bigger than those things that once defined us, and we are able to hold our relationships, our purposes, even our identities as things that are then open for us to work with. Now, the developmentalists are quick to point out that no stage of complexity is inherently better than any other stage, and that this chart is definitely not a chart of people getting happier over time. There is research, though, by Bob Anderson and others showing that effective leadership and developmental complexity are highly correlated. So why am I talking about psychological development? I say all of this in order to make 2 points. One, we can grow. We can grow to handle more complexity and be more flexible and adaptable within our own very selves. And two, our organizations have their own developmental complexity levels that can support certain levels of adaptability and attitudes towards change. Point one, we can grow, we can change. This book by Keegan and Leahy lays out an immunity to change mapping model and a process for working through it. If some change or challenge is personally scary to you, this can help you identify why and what's under threat. If you're facing a performance challenge in your working relationships, or maybe you're a team leader that needs to show up differently with your team, this can help you work through the resistance that we have inside of ourselves, something blocking you from your own desired outcomes. Aversion to change within ourselves comes from our values. Our values are trying to protect us, protect our safety, protect our identity, protect all the things that we and our egos hold dear. We have these hidden values deep inside of us, often unconsciously, trying to prevent us from getting hurt by putting up defenses that have worked for us in the past. It's kind of like having one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake at the same time. I heard this precisely from a dear colleague just last year at Tableau, saying, I want to show up in this way as a leader with my team, but I find that I keep falling back on these other behaviors instead. If that sounds like you or sounds like someone you know, that is the moment to turn to this immunity to change model, because you or they are primed for developmental expansion. Now, I want to give a clear disclaimer here that you cannot do this to someone else. You can invite them to see a need, but if they don't share your perspective, well, the reality is we cannot control other people, even if we think the world would turn out better if we could. So I'd encourage you to dive into this for your own sake, or you can invite your team to do it with you. And the book has some examples of this. And if thinking about doing this with your team and opening up about fears and defense mechanisms sounds utterly terrifying to you, like it did to me, well, that takes us to these authors' subsequent book, An Everyone Culture, which applies developmental complexity to organizations. I'll also, side note, mention Brené Brown on the vulnerability front, of course. I think she's fantastic, and if you haven't heard her speak, her first TED Talk or her recent Netflix special are great places to start. But back to Keegan and Leahy, the framing here is, to quote, in most organizations, nearly everyone is doing a second job that no one is paying them for, namely, covering their weaknesses, trying to look their best, and managing other people's impressions of them. How much time and effort goes into this? If you're like me, when you go to work in the morning, you slip on this mask called professionalism. Because aren't we supposed to be professionals after all? But what does that mean? To me, I think the norms and expectations of at least American business culture say that we're supposed to pretend that we don't have emotions, that we are just logical machines, and most of all, that we've got all of our stuff together and are in perfect control. My friends, I will be the first to confess, I fail. I fail frequently and substantially, and I am not in control of everything. And I am sick of pretending to be an invulnerable, independent professional who doesn't need anyone or anything. So this book is about how to turn that around in an organizational culture, from guarding weaknesses to building strengths. What if a company did everything in its power to create a culture in which everyone could overcome their own internal barriers to change and use errors and vulnerabilities as prime opportunities for personal and company growth? Thinking back to lean startup and optimizing for learning, I'm convinced that it applies to people just as much as it does to any sort of product development. This book profiles 3 companies that are doing it, and my 3 biggest takeaways from these deliberately developmental organizations are, first, that people development and profitability are not in conflict. These companies cite the work and time they invest in personal development as one of the chief drivers of their profitability and their business success. Second, that it is possible to bring your whole self to work and to engage more fully with one another as humans, to safely share your vulnerabilities and support each other in our growth in a high-trust environment. And third, these companies are very intentional about the practices that support their culture in this way of being, because this is not an easy shift to make. Right now, we are doing a book club on this book inside of Tableau, looking at the real practices of real companies and thinking about what we might dare to try. Now, my very last tool takes those developmental stages and shows how organizations embody them very directly. Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux builds on a sociological model called Spiral Dynamics by Claire Graves, and also on the integral philosophy of Ken Wilber and others. I'll mention here the three most relevant stages for organizations today. In orange, the organization is like a machine. In green, the organization is like a family. And in the hypothesized next stage teal, the organization operates like an organism. Now, I think the vast majority of companies today are somewhere in between orange and green on this rainbow spectrum here. And there is a culture war going on between the orange culture of hierarchical command and control accountability and the green culture of mission and value-driven empowerment. Companies didn't used to have values. I think a lot of energy goes into the processing of that cultural evolution. And as we look at where all of this is growing towards in the future, Laloux's vision really aligns with Keegan's. He profiles 8 to 12 companies that are doing aspects of these three things: self-management, wholeness, and evolutionary purpose. Self-management does away with the hierarchical org model, stripping out layers of rigidity and bureaucracy and replacing them with more flexible decision-making structures. You can look up sociocracy or holocracy if you want to explore in that direction. Wholeness is exactly what I was propounding on the previous slide. And evolutionary purpose is a little hard to summarize, but I'll say just that it's where everything, even the company mission, is held as object psychologically and is free to change and grow organically. Laloux claims that these companies don't do change management. Rather, instead, that change is just like breathing for them, like a living organism continuously adapting to its environment. Radical stuff, right? But it doesn't require an organization chock full of enlightened gurus, I think, to make this work. It takes, according to this evidence, the right leadership and the right practices. And the practices enable people, whatever their personal development stage, to participate in and support a culture that sustains itself in this kind of continuous changeability. All right, so the one last word I want to plant in your minds today is mindfulness. Maybe you've already picked up on that theme in the many models and tools in this talk, from goals to retrospectives to behavior engineering to structural tension to Agile and Knuth and developmental psychology. Mindfulness is the practice of noticing what usually goes unnoticed, of expanding one's awareness to encompass the water all around us as we swim along. Change management of any kind relies on our awareness of concepts and dynamics that most people just didn't see even 50 years ago. And as we keep seeing more and seeing deeper, I think that change management itself will gradually be dissolved by greater mindfulness and changeability. The world needs to change more and more. And I like to think that that's our shared goal, all of us, in championing data and data science, is to use data to make a dent in the heaps of waste and brokenness all around us. The world needs change, and it needs more change makers. Mindfulness can be a superpower in this, helping us to see more, to grow our perspectives, to hold and encompass more complexity as we strive to meet the challenges of an ever more volatile, uncertain, and complex world. Thank you for trying to change the world. Best wishes in driving change with the humans that are near and dear to you. And thank you for spending your time with me today. I hope it's been rewarding, and now I look forward to engaging with your questions. Feel free to bring more of those forward. And I'll pass things back over to Rafael. Thank you.
James, thank you for that excellent presentation. We'll get started with today's Q&A session, and I want to thank the audience for their participation. We have a great many questions that have come in during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. During this Q&A session, I'll leave up the screen with contact information for James if you'd like to get in contact with him following today's webinar. So let's get started. The first question, James, is if I bring my data to people to build their awareness or sense of urgency, sometimes they critique and nitpick at my data in order to disregard it. Do you have any tips for when people are fighting what the data says?
Ooh, yes. And of course, I've seen this within Tableau a lot. I mean, within Tableau or data viz companies, so like everybody has every opinion about every visualization and whether it's accurate and whether it's really representing what's really going on in the data. But I hear in that question about people getting defensive and trying to discredit the data, or they're trying to deflect away from something that might be uncomfortable or something that might put them on the defensive. And yeah, that is so common, and it's not the fault of the data, and it's not the fault of you trying to bring that data to them, but really I would encourage you in that case to think about, what's going on in their head and walking in their shoes. What is threatening, or what might be threatening to them, and what needs might they have that need to be addressed? And so thinking kind of about, what is at risk for them? There's a very human dynamic. Oftentimes there's something uncomfortable about what the data says or about some change that should be implied by the data. But really working with people and reaching out and building relationships and trying to build allies, I'd say would be it's really the only way to go. We can't just the solution is not in making that data more clear so that then they nod their heads. Never going to happen. You have to go to them as people and figure out what's the real core issue for them.
Super. James, next question is, where do you see a command and control management style in an agile startup?
Where do I see it?
Yeah.
In an agile startup, in many companies, many places, startup or not, that are trying to do agile, I see command and control. I guess I'll highlight the biggest thing where I see it baked in unconsciously in our assumptions is in decision making. The assumption that the person at the top of the pyramid should make the decisions. And what that does is it tries to suck all the information upwards from the people on the ground, the people that really know what's what, towards that executive or that C-level person who's trying to make this big decision. And it brings the decision-making towards, yes, the person with the most perhaps broadest sight across the organization, but they kind of had the least information. Instead, the inverse of that command and control in that situation would be to bring decisions down to the people that are affected, down to the people that are impacted, and the people that have the most information, to bring the global context down to those people, because I think there is less, maybe global context and prioritization than there is details and complexity on the ground. So how many of us as our organizations start to get bigger, decisions start to seem wonky, and we start to say like, man, what are those executives thinking, as there are more and more layers there. And so that's one aspect of how command and control, it really takes intention and work to try to distribute decision making and to try to engage and use everybody's brain versus kind of making decisions in a traditional centralized manner.
James, it sounds like Tableau has leaders that are open to folks like yourself that want to learn and share improvements on how to deal with change management. And this is one of the reasons why Tableau has such a great product. Do you see newer employees starting farther along with being mindful and open to change at Tableau?
Thank you, for that question. And I think my reaction is my gut says no. I see people, and I've seen, hundreds and hundreds of people come into the development team over the years, and they come from normal places. They come from colleges, and they come from big companies around the industry. And I don't think there's, we love to say, and of course we do, hire great people, and we, try to hold a hiring bar, of course, but I don't think there's an exceptionalism here about the quality of people necessarily that Tableau gets in the door. I think it's so much about the norms and expectations of the culture. And I've seen so many people come in and we even call it decompressing, that people over about a 3 to 6 month period will sort of relax and decompress upon discovering that there are fewer political fiefdoms and turf wars, and that they don't have to be so kind of guarded and defensive of their territory. And I've seen time after time, and I love it, of just how people eventually, relax, and they step further into their confidence, and they kind of expand to in this environment. And so I think the culture has a lot to do with it, and just being intentional about that culture, even for us, it's a battle every day, and it's a battle across the organization. And as our universe keeps expanding, as we keep growing, it's a real struggle. Just even the rate of change and people bringing in their, preconceived assumptions, which we all have from everywhere, and just being able to have that cultural osmosis take place is, it's an ongoing battle, to be sure. But thank you for that question.
James, what if my leadership is not open to change? What can I do then?
And I sympathize, as much as I love most of our leaders here. I definitely sympathize with that question. When leadership is not open to change, it's something that it's hard. It just really is hard because if you pick your battles, even if you pick your battles, you try to fight battles, well, you'll often lose those battles, I think. And so really it's the openness to change. Again, it kind of goes back maybe to threats and what do people feel threatened by. Oftentimes I think leaders can be threatened by what's their value. If they push all decisions down and are just about creating an environment, well, what do they contribute? What's their identity, and what's their value in a more distributed and a more agile and flexible world? So oftentimes I think identity, they may be dealing with identity struggles, but they're still, everybody is good-hearted. Everybody wants the best things, and so I suppose trying to draw them in and trying to paint a picture together, co-create a picture and a vision of what could be, of what changes could be, of what your culture could be, of what your company or your organization could be, or what this change could do for the world. And getting them on board with the vision and the need, even back to Cotter's sense of urgency, I think that's the best thing for at least trying to get them interested. And then they're going to have to grapple with the struggle of, well, what's at risk for me? And what's vulnerable, and am I willing to risk trying for this kind of change?
James, thank you. Great answers to some very good questions. For those of you that asked questions that weren't answered today, we will be sending all unanswered questions to James and the Tableau team so that they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. Please mark the calendars for May the 9th, 2019, and our next Data Science Central webinar, Predictive Modeling's Counterpart, Data Preparation. Also, today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today and can be found on the homepage of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab located at the top of the page. And past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com. If you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. This brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship, as well as to our speaker today, James Baker, for his insight into today's topic. My name is Rafael Knuth, and I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on May the 9th, 2019. Have a great day.